Welcome everybody, and we have started the story of Akedat Yitzchak, which is chapter 22. We began last week with, started with the first words of chapter 22. Vayi achar hadvarim ha'eleh, after these things. So the story of the Akeda takes place after these things, and the question is, what things are we talking about? So we started with Rashi. Rashi interprets that the primary story that connects to the Akeda is the story of Ishmael in the previous chapter. The Banishment of Ishmael, and in particular, we focused in on the role of Hagar, the role that Ishmael's mother plays in the story. And we saw a contrast between Avram's behavior in chapter 22 on one hand, and Hagar's behavior on the other. And it's actually very interesting as a side point that the Torah reading of the first day of Rosh Hashana, and in the Torah there is only one day of Rosh Hashana. So the Gemara says in Megillah, at the end of Megillah, that the Torah reading for the Rosh Hashana, Hashem Akedat Sarah, we read the story of the redemption of Sarah, the birth of Isaac. That's where it starts. The Torah, the Gemara doesn't say where it ends. So we don't know. If there's only one day of Rosh Hashana, did they just read chapter 21? How much did they read? Maybe they read chapter 21 and the Akedah. It's impossible to know. In any event, then the Gemara says, now that we have 2 days of Rosh Hashana, on the second day we read the Akeda. So it's always an interesting question why they chose that particular story for that day. And Rosh Hashana is unique because Rosh Hashana, all the readings of Rosh Hashana don't mention Rosh Hashana, neither chapter 21 nor 22, nor the Haftorah of Chana, nor the Haftorah from Yirmiyahu of Rachel. Nothing mentions Rosh Hashana. Rosh Hashana in the Torah says very little about Rosh Hashana. So it's interesting that the choice here is a very interesting choice. And I just wanted to mention that it strikes me that and it's hard to know this, because there can be multiple reasons for the choice. On one hand, the verse says Hashem Pakadet, so God remembers, redeems, or remembers Sarah. And God remembered Chana. And Rosh Hashanah in our liturgy is called Yom HaZikaron, the day of remembrance. The idea of God redeeming, of God remembering, of God taking account of what people do, that's certainly a central theme of Rosh Hashanah. And that's no doubt one of the reasons that they chose chapter 21, Hashem Pakadet Sarah, to be the Kriya for Rosh Hashanah. But I was thinking that actually the birth of Isaac is only the first few verses of chapter of the Kriya. The bulk of the reading, the main story of the reading on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, is not about the birth of Isaac. The main story is about the story of Ishmael, who is laughing or taunting his brother, Sarah's insistence that Ishmael be thrown out of the house together with his mother. And in fact, Abraham does that, sends them out on their journey, and Hagar runs out of water, she gets lost, she casts her child aside and cries, and the Torah says that God heard the cry of the boy, and the angel said to Hagar, why are you crying? I've heard the Torah says God heard the cry of the Kol Hanar, the one over there. Go and take your child and hold your child. We talked about this last week, but it strikes me that actually the main story is about Ishmael. And Ishmael is someone who is problematic. He's banished from the house because he's mitzachek, because he mocks or he taunts. And he and his mother are banished from the house. And Ishmael, who's described both as a young man, a young boy, and a boy, is in terrible trouble in the desert, no water. His mother takes him and places him a distance away. And the Torah says she raised up her voice and she cried. And the next verse is, and God heard the cry of the boy. But the Torah never says the boy was crying. The Torah never says Yishmael is crying. The Torah said God heard the sound of the boy. Not his voice, but the text never says he's crying. The text says she's crying. So it strikes me that actually the story of Ishmael is very appropriate for us, for Rosh Hashana. Rosh Hashana is a day of the word kol hanar, patisat kolah. The word kol, sound or voice, is a term we identify on Rosh Hashana with the shofar, kol hashofar. In fact, the verses in the shofar section all talk about kol hashofar. The people heard the kol, the sound of the shofar. In the Torah reading, there's the sound of Hagar, her kol, and the Torah tells us she creates a sound. But actually, God doesn't hear, God pays no attention to her cry. God hears the cry of the boy, but the cry of the boy is not mentioned. So it's very interesting that the cry of the boy, Basher Husham, the one over there, whatever the circumstances were in the past, he now finds himself in terrible distress. He cries out, one might say, with a silent cry, and God is hearing the silent cry of this child, who is problematic on one hand. He's not a wicked child. He's a problematic child, and God hears the sound, perhaps the sound which can't be heard, the kol demama daka, the sounds of silence. And what could be more appropriate for us on Rosh Hashana? We find ourselves being judged. Nobody's perfect. Some are less perfect than others, no doubt. But we find ourselves, Basher Husham, in a situation, part of it may be our fault. We misbehaved. Part of it is not our fault. Hagar gets lost. We made mistakes because the society is lost, the parents are lost, whatever. And we find ourselves in desperate straits, and we want God to hear our cries, even the cries that we're not crying, the silent cry. We want God to pay attention to the suffering ones. That's exactly the story of the first day of Rosh Hashana. So I wonder, actually, whether, in fact, this choice of Hashem Akedat Sarah and the birth of Isaac and God remembering Sarah may be part of the story. But in fact, the real connection of the Rosh Hashana to the reading is more about Ishmael. Just a thought. In any event, coming back to Rashi, after these things, so Rashi is contrasting the behavior of Abraham in chapter 22 and the behavior of Hagar, problematic behavior of Hagar, her inability to see, her casting the child aside, her lack of faith in the promise, all we spoke about last week. That's Rashi's point, that the Akeda is a contrast. 22 is a contrast to chapter 21. That was Rashi's understanding of Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela. That's Rashi. We began last week, I mentioned that the Rashbam is Rashi's grandson, incredibly important medieval commentary. And the Rashbam is very significant because he is what's called the Pashtan. He addresses what he thinks is the plain meaning of the Torah. He's very well versed in the Torah Shebaal Peh. He's a great Talmudic scholar himself, or a commentary on the Talmud. But in his interpretation of the Torah, he likes to stick to what he thinks is the plain meaning of the text. So he's an incredibly important commentary on the Torah. And the Rashbam, and we'll begin with the Rashbam says, after these things, says the Rashbam, must refer to what comes just before. That seems to be a perfectly logical point. After these things, Achar Advarim Ha'ela, in the beginning of 22, says the Rashbam, should follow what comes at the end of chapter 21. Now, what comes at the end of chapter 21? What is the previous story in the Torah? So the previous story in the Torah, we are told in chapter 21, beginning in verse number 22, that Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, comes out to greet Abraham, and he wants Abraham to swear to him that he will be kind to his descendants. Avimelech says to Abraham, the kindness that I showed you, you should show me. So I was so good to you. Abraham lived in the land of Avimelech in chapter 20, in the land of the Philistines. Abraham leaves, and Avimelech says to Abraham, I want to make a treaty with you. Actually, he didn't actually leave the land, but he's there presently. But I want to make a treaty. Abraham says, I will, and I want you to swear. Says Abraham, Anochi Shaveh, I will swear. However, Abraham rebukes Avimelech about the wells, the water that the sons of Avimelech stole. Fine. Avimelech says, take care of it later, I'll get back to that. So they make a treaty, they swear. Therefore, the place is called Beersheba. The place that Abraham is found is called Beersheba. Kisham nishba'u shnehem, they both swore there. Verse number 31. And they make a covenant. Vayichvetu brit be'Beersheba, they make a covenant, a treaty in Beersheba. Avimelech goes back to the land of the Philistines. And then it says, and Abraham planted a tree. He cried out there in the name of the eternal God. B'Shem Hashem El Olam. Vayagar Avraham Be'eretz Plishtim Yamim Rabim. And Abraham dwelt in the land of the Philistines for a long time. That's the end of chapter 21. After these things, we have the Akedah. So the Rashbam says, after these things must be referred to what comes before. A perfectly logical point. Hard to argue with that. But now the question is interpretation. What does it mean? So the take on it of the Rashbam's take, is that the Akedah is a kind of punishment for what Abraham did at the end of chapter 21. What Abraham did at the end of chapter 21 is to make a covenant, a brit, with Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, for the future. He swears to him. Brit Beersheba. So the Rashbam says that was a mistake. Because after all, the land of the Philistines is going to become the land of Israel someday. And Abraham had no right, made a mistake. He erred in making a covenant with Avimelech and trying to secure his future through Avimelech. So God, in fact, says, you think you're going to secure your future through Avimelech? Let me tell you something. Take your son, your only son, and bring him as a sacrifice, in which case we would say you have no future. So your future doesn't depend on Avimelech. Your future depends on God, on me, says God. So the Rashbam sees the Akeda as a direct result of, as an outcome, a consequence of the treaty, the ill-conceived treaty that Abraham makes with Avimelech. So that's what the Rashbam says. I've summarized the Rashbam. And let me just now offer my own thoughts on the Rashbam. So I have two thoughts about the Rashbam. One is that what he says, that after these things refers to what comes immediately before, strikes me as perfectly sensible and should certainly, I think it's completely logical, and I fully accept that it applies to what comes just before. That doesn't mean we have to reject Rashi, because they're both right. The story could connect to Ishmael, certainly does. The story could also connect to what comes before. But personally, I have difficulty seeing the Akeda as a punishment for what comes before. Because I think the Akeda, strikes me, is a central story of the Abraham narrative. It's God's last communication with Abraham. And it strikes me that it speaks to something much larger than the supposed ill-conceived treaty with Avimelech. I will say that I have a question about whether what the Rashbam argues for altogether is correct. I'm wondering whether the treaty with Avimelech is perceived by the Torah to be sinful. I have grave doubts about that. Later on, for example, in the Chumash, in chapter 26, we have the second story of Avimelech when he comes to Isaac, and Isaac also makes a treaty doesn't say a treaty over there. Let's find that. Oh, I don't have it in this. Yes, let's see if we have that in chapter 20. Let me find that, chapter 26. But Isaac, the story of Avimelech repeats in Genesis 26. Avimelech comes to Yitzchak. He wants to make a deal with Yitzchak. And let's find this in chapter 26. Let's see, where are you? It's, yes, chapter 26, verse 28. Avimelech said to Isaac, we see that God is with you. Let's make a covenant. Let's make a covenant. Again, the covenant is you should not harm me, says Avimelech. It's always about the other guy's responsibility. And it sounds like they swore to each other and they left in peace. So it sounds like there is some kind of covenantal agreement that Isaac makes with Avimelech. It's hard to believe that after Abraham sinned grievously, and we have the Akeda, that Yitzchak would simply follow suit and make an oath and a covenant with Avimelech. So I have doubts altogether about the Rashbam, about whether it's a sin. But the Rashbam is certainly on to something when he says that chapter 22 follows chapter 21. So let me make two suggestions about the connection between the end of chapter, between Avimelech and the Akedah. And my two suggestions are this. The first point, neither of which the Rashbam says, but I think the Rashbam's idea of connecting to what comes immediately before is completely sensible. I would say two things about it. First of all, that what you have at the end of chapter 21, when Abraham is living in the land of the Philistines, but he also lives in Beersheba. It's a funny situation. He's living amongst the Philistines. That's what the verse says. On the other hand, he seems to have his own place, Beersheba, and he says to Abimelech, take these 7 animals as a sign that this is mine. He makes a treaty with Abimelech, he swears, and then it says he planted a tree in Beersheba, and he called there to the name of the eternal God. Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem El Olam, the eternal God. And Abraham dwelt in the land of the Philistines for many days, for many years. So what that sounds like is that Abraham believes through his behavior, planting a tree. If you plant a tree, you plan to be there for a while. And it says Yamim Rabim. It strikes me that one can see Abraham's behavior as Avram thinking, at least through his actions, suggests he thinks he's found the sacred place. His whole life he's a wanderer, Lech Lecha. Starts with walking. And now he believes perhaps that finally, at the end of his life, or close to the end, he has found the sacred place. He calls out to the eternal God, not just to God, but to the eternal God. He plants a tree. He lives there for many years. He thinks he's determined. One of Abraham's missions is to find the sacred place. He's a nomad. He's a walker. He's a traveler. After these things, chapter 22, God said to Abraham, Lech Lecha, get up and leave to the place that I will tell you. The chosen place is not a place that you choose. The chosen place is the place that I choose. So that's one of the connections between chapter 21 and 22. Abraham in 22 is directed to the sacred place within the sacred land, Mount Moriah, a place that God sees or God chooses. So that's one connection. In other words, Abraham is mistaken if he believes he's found the holy place, the sacred place. He hasn't found it yet, because only God determines the place. That's one point. But the second point is the following, that actually, if we accept the Rashbam, that the Akeda relates to what comes immediately before is Avimelech coming to Abraham and saying, let's make a treaty, an oath. I want you to swear you won't harm my descendants. Im tishkali ulenini ulenechdi. I've been so good to you. I've been so kind to you. You should reciprocate to me. Abraham says, I'll do that, but by the way, your servant stole my water. And Avimelech has his answer, his response. And that story at the end of chapter 21 of Avimelech is actually not the beginning of the Avimelech story. The Avimelech story is actually chapter 20. Then the beginning of 21 is about Ishmael. And the end of 21 is back to Avimelech. So what do we know about Avimelech? Actually, my wife, Devorah Steinmetz, wrote a book many years ago. I highly recommend it. It's called From Father to Son. It's a terrific book. It's on Breshit. It's very interesting. And I'll have occasion to reference this either this today or next week. Raises an extremely interesting question about the Akeda. And I wanted to relate to that. I have some questions about it. It's extraordinarily interesting. We'll get there next week. But let's start with chapter 20. Chapter 20, Abraham goes to the land of the Philistines. Right? That's chapter 20, Genesis chapter 20. He goes to Gerar, the land of the Philistines. In chapter 20, when he comes to Gerar, the first thing he says is, "This is my sister." He says that Sarah is his sister. It's not the first time he said it. He said it in chapter 12 when they went to Egypt. And he says it again in chapter 20. Achotiki. At which point, Avimelech, the king of the Philistines, grabs her, takes her. And God appears to Avimelech in the beginning of chapter 20. This is a married woman. Return this woman. And Avimelech says to God, listen, would you slay even a righteous nation? Hagoy gam tzadik taro, in the beginning of chapter 20. He said, she's my sister. And she said, he's my brother. I did this with a pure heart and clean hands. So Avimelech says, what do you want from me? He said, sister. She said, brother. It's her fault. It's his fault. And frankly, God, to be totally honest about it, I got some problems with you too. Would you slay even a righteous nation? Chapter 19 is the story of Sodom. God destroys Sodom. Chapter 20, Sodom are bad people, but me, I'm a tzaddik. I'm a tom lev, I'm a neki kapayim, all the accolades, you know. God says, Gam anochi yadati. I also know that you did this with the clean hands. Therefore, Gam anochi otcha mechatori, chapter 20, therefore, I'm also going to spare you from sinning. And if you don't do it, I'm going to kill you, you and all that you possess. So return the woman to the man. He's a prophet. He'll pray for you and you'll live. And that's a very interesting conversation. And I think it's been misinterpreted by many. So I'm going to put out there what I believe to be true about chapter 20, which is in my wife's book. And I want to put out something about the Akeda. And that is, Avimelech is an excuse maker. Avimelech is a guy who suggests that he's actually the righteous one. He's a tzaddik. He says it about himself. And God's response to Avimelech said, he said, she said, you said. The interesting word in the beginning of chapter 20 is the word gam, also. Hagoy gam tzaddik, would you even kill, also kill a righteous one? He gam he amra, he said, sister, he gam he. And she also said, there's a million excuses. Your fault, her fault, his fault. What's God's answer? Gam anochi yadati. I also know. Gam. I also know what a tzaddik you are. Gam anochi. And I'm going to spare you from sinning. And by the way, if you don't return the woman, I'm going to kill you. You and all that you possess. That is not the way God talks to righteous people in the Bible. Give the woman back to the man. He will pray for you and you will live. That's another indirect critique. Because in chapter 19, Abraham prays for Sodom and they don't live. But you're a tzaddik. I'll tell you what kind of tzaddik you are. You're a tzaddik that if Abraham prays for you, you live. That's how righteous you are. You're not a sodomite. That's true. You're not a tzaddik either. So do what I tell you to do. Otherwise, I plan to kill you. Fine. So Avimelech goes back to Abraham. Remember the story? So what did you do? Did a terrible thing. What is this business? You said that she's your sister. She's your wife. What does Abraham say? Chapter 20, what does Abraham say? Abraham says to Avimelech, I was afraid. I was afraid. The people here do not fear God. and they would kill me on account of my wife. That's chapter 20. What verse is that in chapter 20? Let's find that verse. Chapter 20. Chapter 20, verse number 11. I said there's no God-fearing people in this town. Now verse number 12. V'gam omna. I have another, v'gam. Now I have another answer. You don't like the first answer? I have a second answer, another gam. She, in fact, is my sister. From my father's side, not my mother's side. I took her as a wife. What does he mean by that? Okay, she's your sister. Maybe she's your fourth cousin also, but she's also your wife. So what he's saying is, I didn't lie to you. I see her primarily as a sister. She happens to be my wife, but I took her but basically she's my sister. The relationship is brother and sister. That's the second thing, that's the v'gam. Then he says, in verse number 13, ever since we are wandering aimlessly, I said to her, the kindness you should show me. Every place we go, say always, I am your brother. Say you are my sister. So Abraham has three different answers to the question, why did you lie to me? When somebody gives three answers to one question, usually, not always, but usually, it's problematic. There's one good answer, and often when you give three answers, the real answer is something else. Notice the v'gam. So the Abraham of chapter 20 and the Abimelech of chapter 20 are talking the same language. That's the low point in Abraham's life. And after all, you have to ask yourself the question, why in the world is Abraham in the land of the Philistines altogether? Who told him to go there? We know why he went to Egypt. There's a famine. But why did he go to a dangerous place? Like the way, if people are not God-fearing, he's afraid for his life, her life. So don't go there. There's no reason to be there. So Abraham and Abimelech are talking the same language. The language of v'gam. You don't like this answer? I have another teretz. Says Abimelech, you stay with me. You're a good guy. And he turns to Sarah. I've given your brother 1,000 kesef. Your brother. Unbelievable story. God said to Abraham in chapter 17, Sarah will be the covenantal partner. Her son is covenantal. And in chapter 20, he says she's my sister. Unbelievable. Can't resolve all the Abraham problems now. I plan to give a course after the holidays about Abraham. I have many new ideas about Abraham, but it's very amazing story, actually. But meanwhile, we'll stick with the Akeda. That's chapter 20. Now we come to the end of 21. Avimelech goes to Abraham. Let's make a covenant. Let's make a treaty. Let's make a covenant. Abraham says, I'll make a covenant. I'll swear to you. However, your servant stole my water. Abraham said to Avimelech, end of 21, your servant stole my water. What does Avimelech answer? End of chapter 21. Says Avimelech, lo yadati, chapter 21, just before the Akeda. Says Avimelech, lo yadati miyasat adavar hazeh, verse 26, I don't know who did it. I never heard this before. Someone stole your water. I know nothing about it. We can write the script ourselves, by the way. V'gam atah lo igalatali, v'gam. Teretz number 2, why didn't you tell me? It's your fault. If something bad happened, you're responsible to tell me, v'gam. That's the second answer. First answer is, I know nothing about it. Second answer is, your fault for not telling me. Then the verse continues. V'gam, another v'gam. Anochi lo shemati bilti hayom. First time I'm hearing this, we'll solve the problem tomorrow. Checks in the mail. Here's all the terutzim. I know nothing about it. Someone else's fault. Take care of it later. That's the v'gam. So Avimelech doesn't change. But Abraham changes. Abraham says, okay. In chapter 20, he takes from Avimelech. In 21, he sets aside the 7 animals. This is a sign. This is mine. That's yours. This is mine. He rebukes him. In other words, at the end of chapter 21, Abraham is talking a different language. Avimelech is always the same language. The language of v'gam, the excuse maker, and the self-righteous excuse maker. It's a sickening combination. It's a million terutzim for what's wrong, at the same time presents himself as a virtuous human being. Nothing is more disgusting than that. In any event, I'm not going to get into politics here, but this is, I'm perfect, I'm wonderful, I'm the best, I'm the greatest. Everybody else is guilty. This is Avimelech. But Abraham changes in the end of chapter 20 to 21. And the Akeda, after these things, and what's interesting is after these things, we have the Akeda. Now, what is the purpose of the Akeda? This is a very central question that we'll come to probably next week. What is the purpose of maybe even this week, what's the purpose of the Akeda? It's a test. So the test says in chapter 22 in the Akeda, which is a very short chapter actually, very short story. After Abraham seems to pass the test, God says to Abraham in chapter 22, the angel calls down from heaven, do not sacrifice your son. Ataya dati, now I know, Kirei Elohim ata, you are a God-fearing person. V'lo chasachta et bincha et yechidcha mimeni, you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. And what's interesting is that verse, that pasuk, Ato yodati kirei Elohim ata v'lo chasachta, for the reader of the Torah, the Hebrew reminds us of chapter 20. It's what God said to Avimelech. Gamanochi yodati, I also know what a righteous guy you are. And I have spared you from sinning to me. Yodati va'echsoch. Kiosita, you've done. And the reason that Abraham is afraid in chapter 20, why did you lie? Says Abraham, was in this place, the people are not God-fearing. There are no God-fearing people in this place. But the Akeda, we have exactly that language. But Abraham's behavior, says God, is a demonstration. Ata yadati, now I know, in fact, kirei Elohim ata, you are a God-fearing person. In other words, the purpose of the Akeda, if we see it in the light of the Avimelech story, the Akeda is a further step in the separation of Abraham from Avimelech. And one could say that the Avimelech of chapter 20, the end of chapter 21, is a king. And kings, people in power, often make up their own rules. And the point of the Akeda, whatever we may think, and the Akeda raises 100 questions that we'll deal with some of them. But the point is that Abraham plays by God's rules. Abraham is obedient to God's rules. God demands a sacrifice. Abraham accepts it, despite the fact that if the sacrifice is brought, which is his one remaining child, he has no future. Oblivion, there's no future, because it's all resting on the covenantal possibilities of Isaac. Nonetheless, gets up in the morning to accede to God's demand, doesn't question it, and the Torah calls that Yirei Elohim. So in the line of the Rashbam, I would say, if we read the Akeda story in light of what comes immediately before, which is the conclusion of the Avimelech narrative, then we have a different point over here. It's not about the sin of making a covenant with Avimelech, which may or may not, which may or may not be a sin altogether. I have my doubts. It's not about that. It's about another step in Abraham's separation from Avimelech. In chapter 20, they talk the same language. It's the language of a gam. And in chapter 22, already the end of 21, he rebukes Avimelech with all his terutzim. And in the Akeda, he demonstrates that he doesn't make up his own rules. And therefore, God will spare him, because Abraham did not spare his son. God will, of course, not accept the sacrifice, accepts the substitute for the sacrifice, and confirms the blessing. And this is a very important point, that at the Akeda, Abraham, in fact, discovers the sacred space. Abraham names the space. The space is not Beersheba, because Beersheba is the place that Abraham chose. But the chosen place in the Bible is always the place that God has chosen, HaMakom Asher Yivchar Hashem. That's what I wanted to say about the Rashbam's approach. Not specifically the Rashbam's own interpretation, but the Rashbam's approach about seeing these three words. Achar hadvarim ha'ela, that for Rashi, the primary narrative is Ishmael, and for the Rashbam, the primary narrative is Abimelech. This actually is interesting for another reason. And this is, all of these things require a lot of study. I'll just mention it here. I've spent a fair amount of time on the book of Shmuel that I love dearly. And the main character of Samuel, of course, is David, King David. And what's interesting is that within the book of Samuel, there are many, many stories of Abraham that find an echo in the book of Samuel. And one of them that's one amongst many is this, that one of the issues that the book of Shmuel raises implicitly, the book of Shmuel rarely criticizes, neither does the Chumash. The Chumash will rarely criticize the main characters. The storyteller of the Bible presents it as telling a story, telling facts, without taking a position. Now, of course, the Chumash takes many positions, but it doesn't take them overtly. In the case of Shmuel, in the book of Samuel, we remember that David runs away from Saul. Most of the first Samuel is David's fleeing from Saul, beginning already in chapter 18. Till the very end of the book, chapter 31, he's running from Shaul. And on two different occasions, he makes the attempt to dwell amongst the Philistines. First, he is repelled, and he's afraid for his life. He feigns madness, and he escapes the Philistines. And later in 1 Samuel, David actually lives amongst the Philistines for many months. I believe it's a year and 4 months. Not only does he live amongst the Philistines, but when the Philistines are about to go to war against Israel and against Saul, a battle in which Saul will die, David is invited to go with the Philistines to join the Philistine army against Israel, and he goes. At the last minute, he's turned aside. So the book of Shmuel actually raises a very interesting question about David, which is, how does one understand the fact that David, the future king of Israel, actually lives amongst the Philistines? And not only does he live amongst them, he is bringing tribute to Achish, the king of the Philistines, and at one point, he and his army are marching with the Philistines against Israel. Now, he doesn't actually fight against Israel. The Philistine officers don't want him, but the book leaves open the question, what would David have done hypothetically if they didn't send him away? Would he have turned against the Philistines? That's certainly a possibility. Would he have joined with the Philistines? Hard to believe, but he marches with them. So we don't know what he would have done, but it's very interesting that Abraham lives amongst the Philistines. And as I pointed out, not only does he live amongst the Philistines, which is problematic, he talks their language, the language of the Gam. Here, I've given your brother 1,000 kesef. God is screaming wife, and he says sister. It's unbelievable, actually. So Abraham has to break from the Philistines, which he does, and the Akeda perhaps can be seen in this light. So that's my suggestion, and that's when he discovers the sacred place, discovers God's place. So those are two options. So we've gotten so far to the first three words of the Akedah. Achar hadvarim ha'eleh. At this rate, we'll be here for a long time. But the truth is that after these things has the third possibility. They're all true. Because when you look at chapter 22, the Akedah, what comes to mind immediately is chapter 12. Chapter 12, Vayomra Hashem el Avram, Lech Lecha. God said to Abraham, Lech Lecha, get up and go. Leave your family behind. Leave, right? Go to Lecha mi artzecha mi moladetcha mi beit avicha. Artzecha, leave your land, your birthplace, your father's house, leave that behind. Go to the place that I will show you. That's chapter 12, verse number 1, God's first communication to Abraham. Now we come to our chapter, chapter 22. After these things, God tested Abraham. God said, Abraham, Hineni, we'll come back to that. Vayomer, verse number 2. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac. Lech lecha, pick yourself up and go to the land of Moriah. Bring him there as a sacrifice. Haleu sham li'Allah. Al achad ha'arim asher omar elecha, on one of the mountains that I will tell you. So we notice that chapter 22, verse number 2, sounds extremely similar to chapter 12, verse number 1. Notice even the rhythms of it, the cadence of it. First, the word lech lecha appears only 2 times in the Bible. One is Genesis 12, and one is Genesis 22. It appears no other place. But notice the cadence. Artzecha moladetcha beit avicha, bincha yechidcha asher ahavta. In each case, God directs Abraham to go to the place, in the first instance, that I will show you. Haaretz asher areka, and the second case, asher omar elecha. So right away, the Akedah being God's last communication with Abraham, Lecha being God's first communication with Abraham, we notice the parallel. And since we notice the parallel, we say 2 things to ourselves, which in this case are certainly true. Number 1, when you find one parallel, usually there are 10. That's certainly true in this case. That chapter 12 and 22 have many things in common. Not just the place that I will show you, not just the cadence, not just Lech Lecha, but many others. The centrality of the sacrifice. And when I say things in common, it can have common language and it can be the opposite. It's in common and it's in contrast, but there are many parallels between chapter 12 and 22. When you find 3, there's 6, there's 10. That's number 1. And the second point is that we wonder about the differences. So, for example, if you look at the Akeda, chapter 22, verse number 2, take your son, your only one, etc. Go to one of the mountains, Asher Omar Elecha, that I will tell you. In chapter 12, though, it says, Asher Areka, that I will show you. So what is the difference between I will tell you, Asher Omar Elecha, and I will show you? I will enable you to see. So what's interesting is here in chapter 22, that even though the Torah said, that God says, go to one of the mountains that I will tell you. And in chapter 12, I will show you, our Eka. And in chapter 12, it says that when Abraham traveled, Hashem, in chapter 22, verse 6, 7, God appears to Abraham, and Abraham brought a sacrifice to the God who appeared to him. So 3 times in chapter 12, we have the verb to see. But chapter 22 has not abandoned the idea of Abraham seeing, even though it says the place that I will tell you and not the place that I will show you. But notice the emphasis in chapter 22 of the Akedah on Abraham seeing. For one thing, twice in chapter 22, it says that Abraham lifted up his eyes. Vayisa Abraham et einav, that's chapter 22, both in verse number 4, and then again later in chapter 22, verse number, I believe it's 13. Yes, verse 13 is correct. In both verse number 4 and verse 13, we have the same expression. He lifted up his eyes and he saw. In verse number 4, he saw the mountain from the distance. He saw the place from a distance. He sees from a distance. In chapter 22, verse number 13, he lifts up his eyes and he sees the ram, achar, probably means afterwards he sees it. Maybe it wasn't there before. Achar possibly could mean even behind him, possibly, but it certainly means in this case afterwards. But he lifts up his eyes and he sees. In contrast, for example, to chapter 21, where Hagar's eyes are opened by God, Abraham opens his own eyes. He sees things that are not easy to see far away. And not only that, the very place itself, the place of the sacrifice, Abraham named the place Hashem Yireh, literally God will see, which is known today as the place in which God is seen. Asher Yamer Hayom. So the idea of seeing is a central theme in chapter 22, even though God says to Abraham, the place that I will show you. Now the question is, what do we make of this fact? What do we make of the fact that the idea of vision is central in chapter 22? It appears in chapter 12. But what's the difference between chapter 12 and chapter 22? If you think about it, I think it's fairly obvious that in chapter 12, God says, the place that I will show you. So God is enabling Abraham to see. The point of chapter 22, though, is different. The point of chapter 22 is that Abraham is able to see on his own. He lifts up his eyes. He sees the place from a distance. He sees this ram afterwards. He names the place God will see. He said to Isaac, when Isaac said, Father, where's the lamb for the sacrifice? Elohim Yireh Haseh. God will choose, literally see for God. Yireh. So vision is central. But the point of chapter 22 is Abraham's able to see very clearly in chapter 22. In chapter 12, it doesn't say Abraham sees clearly. Why doesn't it say in chapter 12 that Abraham sees clearly? The reason it doesn't say in chapter 12 that Abraham sees clearly is very simple. Because he doesn't see clearly. Because if he saw clearly in chapter 12, then in chapter 10, then in verse number 10 or 11 of chapter 12, we wouldn't find him going down to Egypt, where he says his wife is his sister. So obviously, he doesn't fully understand the divine command to go to the land that I will show you. If he fully understood it, he wouldn't leave it immediately on account of a famine. He would stay put until permitted to leave. As the Ramban says, our patriarch Abraham sinned grievously twice. He should never have left. He had no permission. And if he is going to leave, he shouldn't put his wife in jeopardy. So he doesn't see clearly. But the story of the Akeda is he understands perfectly, he sees clearly. One might say he doesn't have to be shown the place because he's able to see it on his own. He sees from a distance. Now, 2 points. Why is he able in chapter 22 to see clearly? After all, in chapter 20, he certainly didn't see clearly. He talks Avimelech's language, Agam. I got this excuse, God-fearing people in this place. So we ask the question, so why do you go there? There's no famine. Don't go. She really is my sister. Okay, she's your sister. But she is also your wife. That answer is not very good either. Then his third answer is, why'd you do this? We do this every place we go. That's his third answer, right? That's the answer we often hear. It's a strange behavior. It's a strange custom. It's a strange practice. What are you talking about? We've been doing this for 20 years. I mentioned in the past that one time I was invited to a synagogue. I'm not going to mention the name. They just fired their rabbi. They're looking for replacement. Big synagogue in New York. I said to them, would I come and speak on Shabbos? I said, I'll speak, but let me tell you something straight up. I have no interest in this job. Zero. Come anyway, whatever. So I come anyway, sit me up on top in the beamer there, where the head there near the ark. And the president said to me, listen, we're going to make blessings for the state of Israel and for the United States of America. When you make the blessing for the United States of America, you can talk in Ashkenazis. When you make the blessing for the state of Israel, you have to speak in Sfardit. I said, I'm not doing that. Why not? He says, because it's stupid. I'm not going to be a fool. Fool? We've been doing this for 25 years. Okay. So I didn't do it. It's nonsense. But that's the point. What do you mean it's wrong? We've been doing it forever. That's Abraham's answer. We do this every place. So in other words, does he see clearly in chapter 20? Of course not. But in 22, he sees perfectly. And now the question is, what happens to Abraham that in chapter 22, he sees perfectly, And in chapter 20, he doesn't see it all. How's that possible? So the difference between 20 and 22 is very simple. The difference is chapter 21. It's the banishment of Ishmael. I'm not saying Ishmael is a bad guy. No, maybe he's actually not so bad. But he prevents Abraham from seeing clearly. What Abraham has to see clearly, which is the central theme of the Abraham narrative, is succession. Who is his wife? Who is his covenantal child? And the answer is very simple because God said so. Sarah is your covenantal partner, and Isaac is the covenantal child. Abraham can't see that. He doesn't understand that. And the reason he doesn't understand it starts with the fact that he doesn't see Sarah as a covenantal partner. He sees Sarah, he said it. She really is my sister. You may love your sister, but she's not your covenantal partner. Once Ishmael is gone, he sees perfectly. It's actually very interesting. In a way, it's a tragedy because it could have been otherwise. That's another story. But at the end of the day, Basher Husham, given the present reality, Ishmael prevents him from seeing. So in 22, he sees perfectly. So here, of course, the Torah says, go to the place that I will show you. But the point of I will show you, I suppose I will enable you to see, is Abraham doesn't need to be enabled to see. Abraham sees perfectly. And actually, if we think about it, we'll come to this point later. One of the points of the Akedah is that Abraham is able, in chapter 22, to understand on his own, without being commanded, what the appropriate behavior is. We'll see this later on. So he becomes he's able to be autonomous, to make his own choices, but he's able to make his own choices in consonance with God's will, which I believe is the reason that God doesn't speak to Abraham again. There's no reason to speak to Abraham again, and one possibility is there's no reason to instruct him. It's very clear to Abraham what has to be done, and he doesn't need instruction. So the reason God doesn't instruct is God instructs those who need instruction, but after the Akedah, perhaps we'll see this in one of the next 3 sessions, Abraham sees perfectly himself. So we have 3 possibilities now for the words after these things, achar hadvrim ha'eleh. It relates to Ishmael, says Rashi. It relates to Avimelech, says the Rashbam. And given the parallels of 12 and 22, we would say it relates to the entire narrative. And this brings us to a very central question about the Akedah. How much time do I have left here?
You have about 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Let me get to a central question of the Akedah. It's a funny thing that this question, in the form that I presented, is the most obvious question in the world, and yet it's rarely asked. My experience is that people don't ask the question. There are really 2 questions over here. The Torah says, after these things, Elohim nisa et Abraham, God tested Abraham. Now the question is, which the medievals do ask, is why is there a need for a test? What is the purpose of a test? And they're bothered by the problem, the medievals are, the Ramban, the Radak, others, all of them, are bothered by the problem, why does God need a test? If I give someone a test, someone's in my class, and I give a test, it could be a diagnostic. I want to know, does this student understand what's going on in the class or not? So you give a test, and you find out, you have a lot of questions, and you discover whether the student knows the material or not. But presumably, God who knows everything doesn't need a test to find out. So why is this is the medieval question. So why is there a need for the test? That's the Ramban, that's the Radak. And the Ramban says, no, of course God knows, but the point of the test, says the Ramban, is to be able to reward Abraham, because we know that in potentia, Abraham will do good, but the point of the test is to give Abraham the opportunity to demonstrate that he is a very worthy person, and to give him the rewards that God has promised earlier. That's the Ramban. The Radak has a different approach. The Radak, David Kimchi, says it's not so much for Abraham, it is for the reader who reads the story, who hears the story of Abraham. This will be a model for the student to see how one can properly behave, the degree to which Abraham is a God-fearing person. That becomes an exemplar, an example for all of us. I'm not going to get into the Radak and the Ramban. I think they're both very problematic in terms of the pshat. Certainly the Radak is, but leave that for now. Maybe next week we'll deal with that. But there's a second question, actually, which is, why this particular test? Okay, let's say there's a need for a test. Then why is this the test? Why is the command to sacrifice Isaac the test? And what I suggest is the following. The Akeda is the last time God speaks to Abraham. It is, in a way, the culmination of the entire narrative. The narrative begins with the first Lech Lecha. One way to see the Abraham narrative is to frame it in terms of God's command, God's speech. Lech Lecha number 1 in chapter 12, towards the beginning of the Abraham story, God's first communication. And the Lech Lecha of chapter 22, God's last communication. And the point being then, after these things, which connects up to chapter 12, means after all of these things. To understand the Akedah, you have to think about the Akedah in light of all the stories of Abraham, beginning with the first story of the Lech Lecha of chapter 12 up to chapter 22. And you ask the question, which is a very important question, namely, what is the Abraham narrative about? That is to say, what are the core components of the Abraham narrative? And it strikes me there are two core ideas, two core themes in the Abraham narrative. One I mentioned earlier, Abraham is a nomad, is a wanderer. It's the search for the sacred place. And there are two sacred places in the Abraham narrative. There's the land of Canaan, the land of Israel, which is a sacred place, the promised land, the land in which God is present. And within the sacred place, there's another place, which is the temple, the Mikdash, Mount Moriah, Hara Moriah, the place that God sees, the place that God chooses. So one theme in the Abraham story is the uncovering or the discovering of the sacred place. That's theme number 1. But then there's even a more central theme in the Abraham stories from beginning to end. And it's a very simple theme. We are introduced to Abraham in chapter 12 at age 75. He has no children. His name is Avram. Av is father, Ram is great. Exalted father is not a father. And he's already 75. And he's given a blessing. And the question is, who will succeed him? Will it be the child of his? He has no children. Will it be perhaps his nephew? Will it be the master of his household, Eliezer of Damascus, the one who runs his house, his household, his business or whatever? Who shall succeed Abraham? That is the core question of the story from beginning to end. First you think it's Lot, his nephew, who goes with him. Then maybe it's Eliezer of Damascus. Abraham prays for a child. Yishmael was born. He named him Yishmael. God has heard my prayers. He sees Yishmael as the answer to all his prayers. And then there's Isaac, born in his old age. So these are the two questions. And the problem, the test, now I'll conclude with the following thought. There are many reasons for tests. I mentioned one before, a diagnostic. You want to find out a piece of information. What does somebody know? You go for a test, you're not feeling well. They give you a diagnostic to see what your symptoms are, to see what your blood count is, to see all kinds of things, to figure out what's wrong. That's a diagnostic test. I took many tests in my life, and I can say that the great majority were terrible. That is a waste of time. And I learned nothing from them, with a couple of exceptions. One of my teachers, my first Rabbi actually, his tests were very good. At the end of the year, we got a final. I always learned from his tests, always taught me something, because the test was not just about what you learned. The test was looking at something completely new and trying to figure it out based on what you had learned earlier. It was Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein, my first Rebbe, terrific. And his tests were very interesting because he was interested to see if you actually understood the concepts. That's a different kind of test. That's rare. Here I would suggest that God testing Abraham is exactly that. To test the trial of Abraham, there's a reason he needs to be tested. There's something we don't know if he's learned it yet. And what we don't know whether he's learned is who is the covenantal child. We have reason to believe he hasn't understood it, because if he understood that Isaac was his covenantal child, how could he possibly say that Sarah is his sister? That'd be madness. God said explicitly in chapter 17, but Sarah, your wife, will have a child. And this, I will establish my covenant through Isaac. Abraham said, would that Ishmael live before you. He'll live too. Don't worry about him. I'll take good care of him. He'll be important to be successful. The covenants with Isaac. Did Abraham understand this or not? Good question. From chapter 20, we have to say, not really. How can he say she really is my sister? So therefore, the test is, does Abraham fully comprehend that Isaac is the covenantal child? And here, I will end with the following observation about the Akeda. And we'll continue with this next week. We only have a total of 5 sessions, unfortunately, and there's a lot more here to do. Not just the Akeda and the Chumash, it's the Akeda in terms of the liturgy, which is also extremely interesting. Can't get to everything. But the Akeda begins by telling us, take your son, your only son, the one that you love. By the time of the Akeda, chapter 22, there is only one son left to Abraham, because the other son has been sent away. Ishmael is in the desert, shooting his bow and arrow, whatever, and his mother found him a wife from the land of Egypt. So obviously, he's out of the covenantal picture. There is, in fact, only one son left, because Ishmael is not there. God said, Bincha Yechidcha, the only one. Yechidcha, the Yechid, the only son left. So Isaac, by default, one might say, would be Abraham's successor. But the Torah doesn't want Isaac to be Abraham's successor by default. And the point of the Akeda then is that through the actions of the Akeda, through the narrative of chapter 22, Abraham is to affirm in the positive sense that Isaac is his son. He's going to affirm it in chapter 22 by virtue of reclaiming Isaac. Because at the end of the story, God will call down to Abraham from the heavens and say, don't do it. And Abraham will look up and see and bring the sacrifice, Tachat Beno, instead of his son. In other words, Ishmael is sent away and never reclaimed by Abraham in our Bible. But Isaac is actually reclaimed, redeemed. It reminds me of the mitzvah that we have in our tradition called Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn. The father reclaims this child, affirms actually this is my child. The mother doesn't have to affirm it, she knows it's her child. But the father has to affirm it. So if this interpretation is correct, if the point of the Akeda is for Abraham to affirm in the positive sense that Isaac is his covenantal child, that means that what lies at the heart of the Akeda actually is the act of reclamation, namely the sacrifice. If this interpretation is correct, if the trial was actually a teaching moment, Abraham has to learn through his life experience that Isaac is covenantal, and by implication, Sarah is the partner. He's going to pass this test. And the sacrifice suddenly becomes central to the story. So next week, I want to deal with the sacrifice. We're still in verse number 1, maybe verse number 2. I did want to also deal briefly with the idea of a test and the view of the Ramban and the Radak, the purpose of the test. And I want to just clarify something why I think it's problematic from the standpoint of a literary approach to the study of the Bible, at least my literary approach. I think the Ramban and the Radak certainly are very problematic. But in any event, so what do we have over here? So far, we have essentially 3 views about after these things. We have Rashi as Ishmael, we have the Rashbam, and we have the other point that it's after all the things. It's after the entire Abraham, it's the culmination of the Abraham narrative, and it's going to deal with the core question. When will Abraham discover the place that God chooses? Answer, at the Akeda. When will Abraham figure out how succession will take place? Answer, at the Akeda. And it turns out that these two great lessons come simultaneously. That when Abraham brings the sacrifice instead of Isaac, and names the place that God chooses, he simultaneously does two things. He discovers the sacred place. At the very same time, he is affirming that Isaac is his covenantal successor. And one might even say that the two things have to be simultaneous. He can only discover the sacred place once he understands the dynamics of his family. That's Abraham's mission in life, to figure out the dynamics and to pass on the covenantal blessing. So we'll stop at this point. First of all, if anybody has any questions, please speak up. And I hope to continue next week. Maybe we'll get to verse 2 and 3, who knows. But does anybody have any comments or questions? And then please speak up if you do.
Rabbi Silber, I'm just puzzled that you continue to refer to the sacrifice, and I usually, I say this, of course, with all appropriate respect, I usually correct any either I think of not knowledgeable enough Jews or non-Jews who refer to that, including in print, because in favor of the binding of Isaac, because of course there is no sacrifice. And referring to it as a sacrifice, this is so often done in general discourse, it really, I think, it conveys the understanding that, you know, Judaism and the God of Israel was fine with sacrificing your son. So I'm
but I think you misunderstood what I'm saying. I'm not saying that the sacrifice of Isaac. I'm saying the sacrifice of the ram instead of Isaac. I'm saying the sacrifice of the ram is that sacrifice that he brings instead of Isaac. The act of substitution is an act of reclaiming. That's number one. Number two, it is true that Isaac is not sacrificed. And of course, one could make the strong case that God never intended that in the first place. I happen to believe that God does not intend that Isaac be sacrificed. I think it's also important to take note of the fact, by the way, there are all kinds of midrashim that Isaac in fact was sacrificed, but leave that out. But in the plain reading of the text, I agree with you that we could say it was never God's intention to sacrifice Isaac. The sacrifice I'm referring to is the sacrifice of the ram that Abraham brings instead of his son. Having said all that, I would point out something about the Akedah, which is, it is true that Abraham only binds Isaac. But I would say from a psychological standpoint, and especially if you're Isaac, even if you're not Isaac, the fact that Abraham was in fact willing to do it, there's no question that he is willing to do it. And the Torah does not seem to condemn the fact, I'll deal with this next week, that he's willing to do it. And I'll just end with the following observation, which is this. Our Amidah, our Shemona Esrei, begins with 3 blessings. The first blessing is Magen Avraham. So there's a focus on Abraham in blessing number 1. The third blessing, Atah Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh, that is a focus on Jacob. I can't demonstrate that now. But the middle blessing is actually a focus on Isaac. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, those who understood this very well, are the Paitonim. In fact, on Rosh Hashana and Yom Kippur, in the Piyutim, if you look at them and study them, you will see that the Piyutim on the first blessing of the Amidah primarily focuses on Abraham, sometimes on Sarah. And the Piyutim on the second blessing, on Tchiyat HaMetim, is always Isaac and sometimes Rebecca. And the idea that Isaac actually represents resurrection from a psychological standpoint is 100% true, because maybe he wasn't sacrificed. But in point of fact, Abraham was going to sacrifice him. So Akedat Yitzchak, yes, God never intended it. Okay, but Abraham doesn't seem to know that. And he's willing to do it. And in fact, his willingness is supported by the text. There is not a shred of evidence in the Chumash. and I don't care what anybody says about this, there is not a shred of evidence that the Torah condemns Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Not a shred, quite the opposite. We'll deal with this next week. So yes, just to clarify, I was referring to the sacrifice instead of Isaac. But number two, the idea that Isaac actually might have been sacrificed is something that's clear. It never happens because God prevents it. But Abraham was certainly willing to go through with it, even though, and we'll see this next week, he has questions, I think, about whether God wants it or not. This is one of the great paradoxes of the Akedah, and we'll deal with this next week. So anyway, thank you for the opportunity to make that clarification. Anything else?
Yeah, I think that, you know, when you first said that in Lech Lecha, God showed Abraham the place, and in the Akedah, he said, Echa, that first, I'll tell you, where to go, and afterwards he said, I'll show you where to go. And I think that shows us that at the Akedah, maybe Abraham really was tested, but he was tested to know whether he was beyond being told. And so God shows him the place.
Well, Tova, I was saying that in the Akeda, it doesn't actually say that God shows him. He says he sees it by himself. So I think that...
Because just telling him, though, wasn't enough. And so he had to see, and he had to see the ram, and he had to...
Right, okay, I agree with you. I think that the Akeda is, he's able to see it, but he sees it on his own. He's not actually told to bring the animal as a sacrifice. It's very striking that the ram, he wasn't instructed, bring this ram instead of Isaac.
No.
He understands on his own, and that was my point earlier.
But only when he gets there. Only when he gets there.
Okay, when he
does
gets there. But
before he takes him. And God says, I will show you the place. He does, he doesn't say, just like, we know that he argues with God a lot. But here he doesn't, and he doesn't say, well, this doesn't seem to be compatible for what you've been telling me up to now, that I should take and kill this son.
That's right. He doesn't, so this I'll deal with this next week. He doesn't, it's true that earlier in the Torah he argues with God. For example, in the story of Sodom in chapter 18, he has a whole negotiation. Here he doesn't say one word, not one argument. But my point earlier was that God didn't say to Abraham, okay, God said, do not sacrifice Isaac. That's what God said. But God did not say to Abraham to bring a sacrifice. So next week I want to talk about, that's something Abraham comes to understand on his own. And I wanted to talk about that understanding that Abraham has, which is on his own. It's once he gets there, that's true. But he understands by himself there has to be a sacrifice instead of Isaac. That I wanted to talk about. And so we'll get to that hopefully next week. And also the question that you raised about Sodom, how come in Sodom he prays? But in the case of the Akedah, it doesn't say one word. He gets up in the morning, early in the morning, he's off to sacrifice Isaac. So what happened to his Abraham, who was willing to negotiate and fight for Sodom, but not willing to argue for his son? So we'll deal with those two questions next week. Thank you for that. Okay, so we'll stop at this point then. So next week we'll continue and see how far we can get. Thank
Perfect.
you all.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Silber, and thank you all for joining us today on Zoom, on Drisha live stream, and Facebook. So tomorrow afternoon at 12 p.m. Eastern, we're going to continue our Ella programs with the start of a new two-part series, How to Blow the Shofar, a tutorial with Rabbi Moshe Silber. Many of our Drisha alumni actually may remember him from our Yamim Noraim Minyanim. He blew the shofar for us for a number of years. And then on Thursday, we're going to continue with part 2 of both Rabbi Dr. Ariel Evan Mays' class on Hasidism and Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Zakir's lecture on Atonement of Yom Kippur. That's at 1 and 8 p.m. respectively. If you haven't yet registered, there's still time. For more information, visit our site, www.drisha.org/classes, and the Zoom and the Facebook Live and the Drisha Live links are all posted in each class. Thank you again, Rabbi Silber. We're happy to have had this opportunity to learn with you again, and look forward to seeing you along with everyone else who joined us today in next week's session, same time, same place, and maybe even sooner in our other upcoming Drisha classes. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Liz, I wanted to add two things. First of all, Moshe Silber did blow the shofar at the Drisha Minyan for 40 years, and there was a big article about him in the Jerusalem Post, if you saw, and also Times of Israel. He organized a couple of months ago a group of people who are going around Jerusalem to blow shofar for people that can't hear the shofar. He wants everybody in Jerusalem to be able to hear the shofar. So we organized this whole business where he and others will sound the shofar for people who can't get out of their homes due to the pandemic. So that is great. Number two, everybody should know that starting, I believe, next Sunday night or Monday, there's a whole Drisha program taking place in Israel for all in Hebrew. Some of those classes, if they're given in the evening, will be accessible to people here who understand the Hebrew. It's all in Hebrew. But at the same time, we're doing the Elul program here with our various classes, 8 or 9 classes, sessions, classes, whatever. There'll be a whole big program in Israel as well. So the pandemic, which is a disaster from one perspective, has given us an opportunity to reach a lot more people with the Torah. Anyway, thank you all for participating. Look forward to next week.